Varick's coffee house stood at the bottom of a lane that ran down to the water, where the fog came up off the river each morning and hung about the chimney pots until the fires were lit. It was a low, warm, smoke-stained place, and it had nothing to recommend it to the fashionable world but the one thing that could not be bought elsewhere. At the long table beneath the harbor window, the men who gathered there each day set their names and their fortunes against the ships of the sea. They were underwriters. When a merchant wished to send a cargo out to the Indies or across to the Baltic, and could not bear alone the chance that wind and water might swallow it whole, he carried his ship and his voyage down to Varick's. There the men at the long table wrote their names beneath the risk, and took his money, and promised to make his loss good if the sea should take the vessel. They lived, all of them, by the reading of danger. A shilling misjudged upon a hull was a shilling given away. A gale foreseen was a fortune kept. At the head of the table sat Julian, Duke of Ravenscar, a tall man in a dark tailcoat, black hair swept back, a hard, clean, shaven jaw. He did not need the coffee house. He had land in 3 counties and a name older than the harbor itself, and he came to Varick's only because the sea was the last honest gaming table left to a man who had grown weary of every other, and because his word upon a policy could carry a risk that lesser men feared to touch. When Ravenscar wrote his name, the rest of the table wrote theirs beneath it, and the merchant went home content. The Duke was seldom wrong. He had never once, in the memory of that room, been made to look a fool. Beside him sat Mr. Josiah Peck, a broad grey whiskered man in a snuff-brown coat, who had underwritten voyages since before the Duke came into his title, and who trusted nothing that had not first been proved to him twice. Around them ranged the others, Colfax, who followed the fashion, Sir Hugh Marden, who followed Ravenscar, a half-dozen more who followed whoever had last been proved right. They took their coffee thick and their risks fashionable, and they thought the table the whole of the world. There was a ritual to the place that never varied. A merchant would come in from the cold with his ship and his voyage, and stand at the foot of the table with his hat in his hands, and state his business, so many tons, such a cargo, bound to such a port, sailing on such a tide. The runner would fetch down the great register, and read out what was known of the ship, her age, her build, her master, the last account of her. Then the men would price her. One would name a premium and a line, the share of the risk he would carry, and set his name to it, and the next would follow beneath him, and the next, until the whole of the risk was covered, and the merchant had his insurance, and the table had his money. Over it all, upon the rostrum by the harbour window, hung the brass loss bell, which was rung once, slowly, for every ship the sea was confirmed to have taken, so that no man at Varick's could forget, even in a fat season, what it was he trafficked in. In 30 years the bell had rung for a great many ships. It had never yet rung for a ship of the Duke's. Into this room, on a grey morning at the turn of the year, came Cordelia Vane. She came not to underwrite, but to collect. Her father, old Marcus Vane, had kept a modest name at that table for 30 years, a careful man who had never grown rich and never once been ruined. And when the winter fever took him, it had fallen to Cordelia Vane, a slight woman in an ivory and navy gown, dark hair drawn back, a level grey gaze to close his accounts. She had kept his ledgers since her hand was steady enough to hold a pen. She knew to the shilling what the sea still owed the house of Vane, and she had come to see it paid. She was no stranger to the trade, though the men chose to treat her as one. Marcus Vane had been a widower with no one to teach but the person at his elbow, and the person at his elbow had been Cordelia, and so from the time she could reckon she had reckoned for him, copied his policies in a fair hand, footed his columns, read him the shipping intelligence over supper, when his eyes began to fail him. She had sat unnoticed in the corner of his counting house through 1,000 conversations about ships, and had formed, without anyone intending it, the habit of pricing every voyage in her own mind before her father spoke, and then marking how near she had come. For years she had come very near. In the last years she had more often been nearer than he. None of this was known at Verrick's, where old Vane had been a familiar figure and his motherless keeper of accounts an invisible one, and where it was taken for granted, on the morning she walked in, that a woman with a ledger was a woman playing at a man's game. It was the assumption she found most useful of all, and she took care never to correct it a moment before the sea corrected it for her. The talk stopped when she entered, then started again, lower, with the particular hush men use when they mean a woman to hear that she is being discussed. Cordelia paid it no mind. The waiter, not knowing what else to do with her, brought a dish of coffee she had not asked for. She set it aside untouched, unrolled her father's last slate upon a corner of the long table, and began, quietly, to check its figures against the book upon her knee. It was Colfax who made the jest to please the Duke. There was a voyage on the table that morning that no one liked. A coasting brig, the Astrea, bound north through waters where the winter had already taken 3 ships, and the premium the merchant offered was thin as broth. "Let the lady price it," Colfax said, laughing before he had well begun. "She has old Vane's book by heart, they say. Come, madam, what will you take to underwrite the Astrea?" It was meant to raise a laugh, and it did. The men leaned back to enjoy it. The Duke did not laugh. He merely watched her over the rim of his cup with the faint contempt of a man too well bred to trouble himself over a jest already made. He expected her to colour and gather her slate and go. Cordelia set down her pen. "I will not take her at all," she said, "at that price." "There," said Colfax, delighted, "the lady declines. A woman's nerve." "Not nerve," said Cordelia, "arithmetic. The Astrea's master is Hollis, who ran the same coast last winter and put his last brig on the Gunfleet sand in a fog, because he will not lie to and lose a tide. The waters have taken 3 ships since the solstice, which means the offered premium is built upon a good season, and this is not a good season, and the merchant offers you 8 guineas upon the 100 to carry a risk that wants 14. You are being invited to buy a shilling for 1 6 and call it a bargain because a duke sits at the head of the table. She picked up her pen again. "I will not take her at 8. I would take her at 15. And reef my own sails at that." The room had gone very quiet. Miss Peck, the broad grey-whiskered man in the snuff-brown coat, set down his cup with a small, deliberate click, and looked at her along the table as a man looks at a card that has fallen from a sleeve. The Duke smiled, at last, because contempt is easiest to wear as amusement. "Then by all means, sit," he said, and gestured to the empty stool at the far foot of the table, the place where the runner sat to fetch the almanac. Sit, Miss Vane, and keep the book for us. It will amuse the table to have a lady price the risks she declines. We shall see by spring how old Vane's arithmetic answers to the sea. He meant it for a humiliation, and every man in the room understood it so. They gave her the quill to make sport of her. Cordelia inclined her head, gathered her slate and her book, and crossed the room, and sat down at the foot of the underwriter's table with her back straight and her grey gaze level, as though she had been invited to a feast. That was how it began. They let her sit at the underwriter's table as a joke. For a fortnight she said little and wrote much. She kept the book, because they had told her to keep it, entering each voyage the table took, each premium, each name, in a clean, upright hand that shamed the Duke's own runner. And she watched. She watched the way Ravenscar priced a risk in the time it took to drink half a cup. Quick and sure, and always a little cheaper than the man beside him, so that the good business flowed to his name, and the table followed. She watched the merchants who came to Verrick's, the honest ones who told you the truth about their bottoms, and the sly ones who did not. And she watched the weather glass by the harbour window, the tall barometer in its mahogany case, which the men glanced at from habit, and Cordelia read like scripture. The first time she was proved right, no one remarked it, because being right quietly is the loneliest thing in the world. The Astrea, taken by another table at 9 guineas, was lost on the Gunfleet in a February fog with all her cargo, exactly where the Master Hollis had put his last brig, and the underwriters who had thought themselves clever paid out £400 and blamed their luck. Cordelia entered the loss in the book without a word. But Mr. Peck read the entry over her shoulder, and then he read her, and after that he began to come and stand behind her stool of a morning, not to correct her figures, but to see them. You priced her at 15, he said one day low, so the Duke should not hear. I did. The table thought you timid. The table, said Cordelia, confuses a thin premium with a small risk. They are opposite things. A thin premium on a large risk is the most dangerous object in this room, because it looks like a gift. She dipped her pen. My father used to say that any fool can be brave with the sea. The sea does not care how brave you are. It cares whether you counted. Mr. Peck said nothing to that, but the next voyage the table debated. He waited until Cordelia had quietly written a figure on her own slate before he gave his own, and when the figures differed, it was Peck who altered his. There was a Baltic voyage that taught the table something about her, though most of them were too proud to keep the lesson. A merchant named Guthrie brought in a timber ship, the Raven, bound home from Mamel deep laden with deals and spars, and he offered a handsome premium, and seemed in a great hurry to be covered. The table liked the look of it. Timber floats, they said. A timber ship can be waterlogged to her gunwales and still swim home, and here was a fat premium for a floating cargo. Ravenscar priced it and reached for his pen. Cordelia from her place down the table asked one quiet question. She asked what the Raven was insured for against what she had cost, for she had heard the figure the runner read out, and it had struck her as strange. The vessel was valued in the policy at half again what such a ship and such a cargo were worth in any yard on the coast, and the merchant Guthrie was in a great hurry. And a ship worth more sunk than swimming is the oldest danger in the trade. She said the word for it plainly, though it was not a word the men supposed a lady would know. Barratry, a master paid to lose his own ship, a merchant paid twice, once by the sea and once by the underwriters, for a voyage he never meant to complete. The table laughed at her, at the notion of fraud where they smelled only profit, and took the Raven at Guthrie's fat premium. The Raven was run ashore in fine weather, on a clear night, on a coast, her master knew like the back of his hand, and the cargo was salved by men who happened to be waiting upon the beach, and the underwriters paid Guthrie his inflated value, and never proved the thing they all by then privately suspected. Cordelia had written no line upon the Raven. She entered the loss in the book, and beside it, in her small hand, the single word she had spoken, so that the next time such a voyage came to the table, there should be a record that one person had named it before the fact. After the Raven, the table stopped laughing quite so readily, though it did not yet leave off laughing altogether. Then there was the matter of the Halcyon, which taught the opposite lesson, that Cordelia would as gladly decline a fashionable risk as embrace an unfashionable one, and cared nothing which way the room leaned. The Halcyon was the darling of that season, a new-built Indiaman, copper-fastened, a famous master, bound out with a rich cargo, and every underwriter in the room wanted a line on her at the thin premium her owners offered, because to carry a piece of the Halcyon was to be seen to carry it. Ravenscar took a great line. The table crowded in beneath him. Cordelia declined her altogether. She had read, in the shipping intelligence the men skimmed and she studied, that the Halcyon's famous master had quarrelled with his owners and been put out at the last hour and a stranger set in his place, that her sailing had been held back a fortnight into a worse part of the season to load an extra tier of cargo, and that the extra cargo had brought her a full strake deeper than her marks. A crowded ship, a strange master, a late start, a foul season, the fashion saw a famous name, and Cordelia saw 4 small wrongnesses standing in a row. She would not take the Halcyon at any premium, and said so, and the table thought her merely timid once again. The Halcyon was not lost. That was the hardest kind of being right. The kind that leaves no proof she came home safe, a fortnight late, having sprung her rudder in heavy weather off the Cape and very nearly not come home at all. And the underwriters who had carried her congratulated themselves on their courage, and forgot that courage had had nothing to do with the matter. Cordelia forgot nothing. She had learned that being right and being believed were 2 different trades, and that she was, for the present, permitted to practice only the first. There was, too, the affair of the Signet, a South Seas whaler bound out on a voyage of 2 years and more, the kind of risk the table treated lightly, because it was romantic and far off, and no one expected to settle it soon. The men priced her by rule of thumb and reached for their pens. Cordelia asked to see the owner's account of her outfit and her crew, and read it through, and priced her 1/3 higher than the table, because a voyage of 2 years is not 1 risk, but 100 risks, strung, end to end, scurvy and mutiny and ice and a lee shore on the far side of the world, and a master who must be his own underwriter for 2 years together, with no coffee house to run to. The owner grumbled at her figure and took the table's cheaper one. 2 years and 4 months later, the Signet came home with half her crew and a broken voyage, having lost boats and men off a coast that had no name on any chart at Verrex, and the underwriters who had priced her by rule of thumb paid dearly for their romance. By then it surprised no one that the vain figure and the true cost of a thing had turned out once again to be the very same number. She earned her way up the table by inches, the way water works into oak. There came a West India merchant named Ode with a rich cargo of sugar and rum, a good sound ship, a fair season, and the table fell on the premium like gulls on bread. Ravenscar priced it low to keep the business under his own name, and the others crowded beneath him. Cordelia priced it lower still, not because she was braver, but because she had seen the ship at her moorings the week before, and knew her freshly graved and coppered, and knew the master a sober, careful man, and knew, from the almanac she alone bothered to read, that the moon and the trades both favored the passage. She took a larger line than the Duke at a smaller premium, and the table laughed at her again, softly, for undercutting the head of the table. Then the ship came home in 9 weeks with her cargo dry and her hull sound, and Cordelia's line paid her cleanly while the table's laughter turned, by slow degrees, to a thing that watched her sideways. By the turn of the season, she no longer sat at the very foot of the table with the runner. No one had formally moved her. She had simply been consulted one morning upon a risk she happened to have studied, and had answered so exactly that the merchant took her figure over the Duke's own. And after that, the men nearest the foot found small reasons to leave the stool beside them empty, so that when she came in, she sat a place higher, and then a place higher than that. Miss Peck, the broad grey whiskered man in the snuff-brown coat, had made himself quietly her ally, not from any warmth, for Peck had no warmth to spare, but because in a long life of pricing the sea he had learned to prize the one thing rarer than nerve, which was a person who was right, and he did not care in the least what such a person wore or was called. He began to carry her the hard cases, the risks the table could not agree upon, and to lay them before her as a master lays a problem before the one pupil worth the teaching. The Duke watched this from the head of the table and said nothing, but a line had come into his face that had not been there at the turn of the year. The Duke did not laugh, and he did not watch her sideways. He watched her straight on now, over the rim of his cup, and the contempt in his face had curdled into something harder to name. Then came the Perdita, and the table drew back from her as from a thing diseased. The Perdita was a bark of 300 tons, bound out for the Levant with a general cargo and freight for her owner's account, and there was not an underwriter at Verrick's who would set his name to her at any price. There was a story about the Perdita. Her last master had died aboard of a fever off Malta. Before that she had lost a mast in weather that ought not to have carried one away, and a whisper had followed her home that she was rotten in her timbers, unlucky in her bones, a coffin looking for a sea to sink in. When her owners brought her to the table, the men looked at the offered premium, a fat one, 18 guineas upon the 100, for the owners knew the story too, and to a man they declined her, because it is a hard thing to write your name beneath a ship the whole room has agreed to fear. Let it go to the country underwriters, said Colfax, with a shudder half for show. I'll not touch her. There's a smell of the churchyard on that hull. Even Ravenscar waved the Perdita away, not from fear, for he feared nothing, but from a nobleman's instinct that one does not soil one's name upon a vessel the fashion has condemned. "A shipman will not insure is a shipman will not freight," he said, "and a ship without freight is a loss whether she swims or sinks. Let her rot at her moorings. It is where the story says she belongs." Cordelia asked to see her. She went down to the water that same afternoon in her ivory and navy gown, and stood on the quay in the cold wind, and looked at the Perdita a long while before she went aboard. And on the deck she found Captain Allard Frey, a weathered sea captain in a salt-stiff blue coat, his face seamed and brown, who had taken the Perdita's command precisely because no better ship would have a master with his want of interest and his surplus of skill. Frey did not flatter her and did not gape at her. He answered her questions, which surprised him, for they were the right ones. She asked to see the ship's copper, and Frey showed her where the Perdita had been newly sheathed below the waterline not 4 months past, bright metal against her worm-safe planks, done at the owner's cost when they meant to sell her, and abandoned when the story sank her price. She asked to sound the timbers the story called rotten, and Frey handed her the mallet himself, and the sound that came back from stem to stern was the hard, clean ring of sound oak, not the dull note of rot. She asked about the mast that had failed, and learned it had failed because a drunken rigger had set a defective spar since replaced, and not because the ship was cursed. She asked about the master dead of fever, and Frey said plainly that a fever off Malta was a fever off Malta, and would as gladly take a duke as a bark, and had nothing to do with the soundness of a hull. And last she asked what route he meant to run, and Frey traced it for her on his own chart, not with the great West India convoys where every fashionable ship was bound, but alone and eastward by a passage he knew, and the fashion did not. They talked a long while on the Perdita's deck, the captain and the slight woman in the ivory and navy gown, while the cold wind came off the water, and the ship moved beneath them like a live and patient thing. Frey told her how the story had begun, because she asked him, and the telling of it was itself the proof of what it was worth. A rival owner had wanted the Perdita cheap, some seasons back, and had let it be known in the right taverns that she was unlucky. And a fever that would have been called God's will aboard any other ship was called the Perdita's curse. And a spar that failed through a drunkard's carelessness became, in the retelling, the ship's own rotten bones giving way. Nothing had been said that was quite a lie, and nothing was true, and the whole of it together had followed her home and settled upon her like a second cargo she could not discharge. A ship's name is worth more than her copper, and far harder to relay, Frey said, and mine has a bad one, honestly come by, which is to say, dishonestly given. He did not ask Cordelia to pity the Perdita, and he did not promise her the ship would swim. He told her only what was true of the hull, and what was true of the sea he meant to sail her over, and left her to do the arithmetic, because he had taken her measure in an hour, and knew that arithmetic was the thing she trusted, and pity the thing she despised. It was the most honest account of a risk Cordelia had heard since her father died, and it came from the one master in the harbour the fashion had agreed to call unlucky. And she thought, walking back up the lane, that there was no surer way in the world to find a bargain than to buy the sound thing a frightened fashion had agreed to sell. Cordelia went back up the lane to Verrick's, and she took the Perdita. She took the whole of her, the entire risk at the fat premium of 18 guineas the owners had offered in despair, and she wrote her single name beneath it in her clean upright hand, where the Duke and all his table could see it. The room fell silent, then tittered, then laughed outright. Colfax told the story at 3 dinners that week of the vain woman who had bought the coffin ship at a churchyard price, and the table settled in to enjoy the spectacle of her ruin. Mr. Peck came to her that evening when the table had thinned and stood by her stool with his hands behind his back and his grey whiskers working. He did not tell her she was wrong. He was too honest for that, and he had checked her reasoning himself and found no fault in it. He told her only what it would cost if the sea, which owes no one an argument, should take the Perdita despite every sound reason it ought not. She would lose the better part of what her father had spent 30 careful years to build, and she would lose it publicly, at the very table that had seated her as a jest, and the loss would be told and retold in this room for as long as any man in it drew breath. "I know what it will cost," Cordelia said. "I have priced it. That is the whole of my trade." Peck looked at her a long moment, and then he did a thing he had not done for any underwriter in 20 years. He asked to take a small line on the Perdita himself, beneath her name, £100 of the risk, not because he wanted the premium, but because he wished it known, when the account came home, that old Josiah Peck had read the same ship she had and reached the same figure. It was the nearest thing to a benediction the table had in its gift, and Cordelia accepted it with a grave inclination of her head, and entered his line in the book beneath her own. "You have wagered a great part of your father's name," said the Duke to her, quietly, when the laughter had died. He did not sound triumphant. He sounded almost as though it troubled him. "On a ship every man in this room has refused. Why?" "Because every man in this room refused her for the story," said Cordelia, "and I refused the story and read the ship. Her copper is 4 months old and bright. Her timbers ring sound. Her master is the best in this harbor, and unwanted only because he is honest about ships men wish to lie about. And she sails a lonely eastern passage while your whole fashionable table crowds the western convoys. She capped her ink. The premium is fat, because the fear is fat. The risk is lean. I am not brave, your grace. I have merely counted a thing you are all too proud to count." Ravenscar looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind the hardness of his face, the first small crack in it, though he mastered it before it showed. "We shall see," he said, "what the sea makes of your counting." And he turned back to his own book and to the fashionable West Indiamen that were filling it that season faster than any man could recall. It was those West Indiamen that undid him, though neither he nor the table saw it, and it was Cordelia who saw it first. She saw it because she kept the book. Keeping the book, the thing they had given her to shame her, had made her the only person at Verrick's who saw every risk the table took written down together in one hand, one page beside the next, where the shape of the whole could be read. And through the back half of that winter, as she copied the voyages into her clean columns, a shape began to rise off the page that turned her cold. The Duke was filling his book with West Indiamen. Fine ships, all of them, sound and fashionable and cheaply insured, the Fortitude, the Providence, the Concord, the Amity, and a dozen more, each brought to the table by a different owner or agent, each priced low, because each, taken alone, was a good safe risk. Ravenscar took a line on every one, pleased to fill his book with sound premium at a season when the fashion ran his way, and the table filled its books beneath him, as the table always did. Safe ships. Safe money. The whole room agreed. But Cordelia kept the book, and in the book the ships lay side by side, and one grey afternoon she stopped with her pen in the air and did not move for a long time. She had begun, from mere habit of thoroughness, to note beside each voyage the small particulars the table thought beneath them, the builder's mark on the hull, the name of the surveyor who had passed her, the sailing agent who cleared her papers, the orders under which she sailed. And the particulars read down the column were all the same. The Fortitude and the Providence and the Concord and the Amity, though they wore 4 owners' names upon their papers, carried the same builder's mark cut into their beams. They had been passed by the same surveyor's hand. Their papers had been cleared by the same sailing agent, a man named Sable. And their orders, when she traced them, were one order, to sail together, in company, with the great autumn West India convoy, out and home by the same track across the same ocean in the same season. They were not a dozen risks. They were one risk wearing a dozen names. She did not trust it at first, for a careful reader trusts a frightening conclusion least of all. She went back through the book a second time and a third, checking each particular against the register and against her own memory of the merchants who had brought the ships to the table, and each time the same shape rose off the page. She walked down to the water on a pretext and looked at 3 of the ships herself where they lay loading, and found the same builder's mark cut into the beam of each, the mark of a single yard upriver, and found the same agent's man, Sable's man, tallying the cargo on all 3 docks. She made discreet enquiry, in the way a woman keeping accounts may make enquiry without exciting remark, and learned that the several owners whose names stood upon the policies were, the most of them, names and little else, that behind the Fortitude and the Providence and the Concord and the Amity stood one concern, one counting house, one man's ambition, spread across a dozen bottoms and a dozen borrowed names for the express purpose that no single underwriter should ever see how much of one venture he had taken upon himself. It was not, she thought, even dishonest quite. It was only fashionable, and fashion is the most expensive thing a prudent man can be persuaded to buy. The Duke had not spread his book at all. He had concentrated the whole of it upon a single throw, one convoy, one route, one passage of one autumn sea, and because the ships came to him under different owners and different names, he could not see that he had done it. He thought he held a dozen safe small bets. He held one enormous one. If the autumn convoy made its passage clean, he would win a modest premium a dozen times over and call himself prudent. But if the convoy were caught, if one great gale found that fleet upon that track in that season, as the equinoctial gales had found fleets before, then every ship in the Duke's book would go down in the same water on the same night, and his losses would not add. They would multiply his whole fortune, and the fortunes of every man who had followed his name beneath the risk, rode upon the weather of a single week. Cordelia sat at the foot of the table with this knowledge, and felt the whole balance of the room shift silently beneath her, unfelt by any man in it. This was the moment the joke ended. Though the table did not know it yet, she had stopped merely pricing risks more shrewdly than the Duke. She had begun to see the ruin he could not, the hidden shape of his own book, the single storm folded inside a dozen safe names. And she understood, sitting there with her cold pen, that she need do nothing brave and nothing loud. She need only keep counting, and hold to her lonely Perdita on her lonely eastern sea, and let the weather do what the Duke had left it free to do. She thought a long while about whether to warn him. It would have been the generous thing, and Cordelia was not ungenerous. But she weighed it as she weighed everything. If she told the Duke his book was one risk in a dozen coats, he would not thank her. He would be affronted that a woman he had seated as a jest presumed to teach him his trade, and he would defend his figures the harder for the shame of them, and the table would follow him deeper in to spite her. She had seen proud men meet the truth from an unwelcome mouth. They do not take it, they take offense. She would spend her warning and buy nothing with it but his contempt, and the convoy would sail regardless. So she did the thing her father had taught her instead. She said nothing, and she prepared. Quietly across the last weeks before the autumn sailings, Cordelia laid off what little correlated risk she carried, and set her own book upon the opposite tack from the Duke's. Where he crowded the convoy, she stood clear of it. She kept her fat, lonely Perdita on her eastern passage, sound of copper and honest of master, exposed to a different sky than the fleet the fashion loved. She took a scatter of small independent voyages, no two bound the same way, so that no single storm could touch more than one. She built, without a word to any man, a book that was the exact reverse of the Duke's, spread where his was stacked, contrarian where his was fashionable, and above all not wagered upon a single week of a single ocean. And then, like every underwriter since the first, she waited for the weather. It was lonely work, preparing for a storm no one else could see coming, in a room grown warm and loud with the confidence of a good fashionable season. The Duke's book fattened by the day. The table drank his wine and priced the convoy cheap, and thought itself the shrewdest gathering in the kingdom. And Cordelia sat among them with the whole shape of the autumn already drawn in her mind, and said nothing, and priced her lonely scattered voyages, and read the glass. More than once she came near to speaking. She was not without conscience, and there were men at that table whose ruin would carry down clerks and households that had never sat at Verrick's in their lives. But she had weighed it, and the weighing always came out the same. They would not believe a warning, they would resent it, and the convoy would sail whether she spoke or held her peace. The only thing her speaking could alter was her own standing, and that for the worse. So she kept the hardest silence of her life, the silence of a person who knows a true thing in a room full of people committed to a false one, and she waited, and she let the sea be the voice they would have to hear, because they would hear no other. The weather came. The autumn of that year turned early and turned hard. The old hands at Verrick's felt it first in their joints, and then in the glass, the tall barometer by the harbour window that Cordelia had read all winter, and the men had only glanced at. Through September it fell, and rose, and fell again, and each fall was lower than the last. Mr. Peck, the broad grey-whiskered man in the snuff-brown coat, took to tapping the glass of a morning and frowning, and Cordelia would meet his eye across the room, and neither said aloud what both had begun to fear. The first losses were small and far away, rumours carried up the lane by ship's letters, a coaster gone on the French coast, a Baltic trader overdue, the ordinary attrition of a hard season. The table paid them out and thought little of it. But Cordelia marked each in the book and watched the pattern of the wind behind them, and she saw the great weather assembling out in the Atlantic the way a careful reader sees the turn of a story 3 pages before it comes. Then the news came that the autumn West India convoy had sailed, 100 sail and more, the fashionable fleet of the season, standing out together upon the same track across the same ocean, and among them, wearing their dozen owners' names, the Fortitude and the Providence and the Concord and the Amity and all the rest of the Duke's concentrated book. Ravenscar heard it with satisfaction. His premium was earned the moment they cleared the land. Now he had only to wait for them home. He ordered a bottle of Varick's better wine and drank a glass to the fashion. And the table drank with him, and Cordelia kept the book. That was the last easy evening the table would know for a long while, though only one person in the room understood it to be so. Cordelia walked home along the water that night, past the empty berths where the convoy had lain, and she looked out at the dark river running down to the sea, and she thought of all the sound ships standing out into the Atlantic in company, and of the one lonely bark already gone eastward under a master the harbor called Unlucky, and of the falling glass she had left ticking down in its mahogany case by the window. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular quiet dread of a person who has done the arithmetic and cannot unlearn the sum. Somewhere out beyond the fog, the weather was gathering itself, indifferent and enormous, and it would arrive when it arrived and settle every account at the table, whether the table was ready or no. She had made herself ready. It was the only mercy the trade allowed, and she had taken it, and there was nothing left now but to keep the book and wait. The glass fell that night lower than any man at Varick's had seen it in 20 years. It fell, and the wind rose behind it, and for 3 days and nights the equinoctial gale came in off the Atlantic and stood the whole coast on its ear. In the harbor below the coffee house the ships snubbed and groaned at their moorings. Slates came off the roofs of the lane. The fog was torn away and replaced with a hard grey scream of weather that flung the river back on itself. The men gathered at Varick's not to underwrite now, but to wait, crowding the harbor window, watching the glass, saying less and less as it sank. And every man in that room knew, without needing to say it, where the autumn convoy was. It was out there. It was on the track. It was in the middle of the sea with nowhere to run. At the precise hour the worst weather in 20 years came down upon it. The Duke stood at the window with his hard, clean-shaven jaw set, and his hands clasped behind his back. And for the first time in the memory of the room, the Duke of Ravenscar looked afraid. They kept a kind of vigil at Varick's through those 3 days. The underwriters who could not stay away, gathered in the warm smoke while the world outside came apart. No business was done. A merchant or two came to the door, looked at the faces in the room, and went away again without stating his errand. The waiter kept the fire up and the coffee coming and said nothing, for there was nothing to say. Men who had wagered fortunes upon the sea stood at the harbor window and watched the sea prove for once exactly what it was, not a gaming table, not a column of figures, but a grey and mindless enormity that did not know their names and would not have cared for them had it known. Cordelia sat a little apart, with the book closed upon her knee, for there was nothing more to write until the accounts came home, and she watched the Duke more than she watched the weather. She had wanted, all season, to see him proved wrong. She found, now that the proving was upon him, that she took no pleasure in the sight of a proud man learning fear at a window, and she marked that in herself as she marked everything, and did not quite know what to make of it. The news came in over the next fortnight the way bad news from the sea always comes, in pieces, each worse than the last. The convoy had been caught upon the track. The great gale had scattered it and swallowed a third of it whole. Ships came limping home dismasted and half drowned. Ships did not come home at all, and among the ships that did not come home were the Fortitude, and the Providence, and the Concord, and the Amity, and every other bottom that had carried the Duke's name upon it into that autumn sea. They had gone down together, in the same water, on the same night, exactly as one risk goes down, because that is what they had always been. The particulars came up the lane one after another, and Cordelia entered each in the book with a steady hand, though her heart was not steady. The Fortitude foundered with all hands 2 days out from the islands, seen to go by the Amity before the Amity herself was overwhelmed. The Providence, dismasted and driven onto a reef with the loss of her cargo and the most of her people. The Concord, simply gone, never spoken again by any ship, swallowed so wholly that the sea kept even the manner of it a secret. And the smaller names behind the great ones, the borrowed names Sable had strung across the venture to hide its size, they came in too, one after another, each a line in the Duke's book, each a stroke waiting upon the bell. She had foreseen the shape of it for a whole season. She found that foreseeing a thing and reading its true name off a ship's letter, with the wet ink of real drowning upon it, were not the same and never would be, and that this was proper, and that an underwriter who ever forgot the difference had no business at the table. At Varick's the brass lost bell over the rostrum began to toll. It was the old custom of the house to ring the bell once for each ship confirmed lost, so that every man in the room should stop and hear his fortune leave him. And through that grey fortnight, the bell tolled and tolled until the sound of it lived in the walls. Each stroke was a ship. Each ship was a line in the Duke's book. The men who had written their names beneath his stood white and silent as the bell counted out their ruin, and Ravenscar stood among them and heard, stroke by stroke, the collapse of the whole safe, fashionable book he had thought so prudent, the dozen small bets that had been one great bet all along. Colfax, who had told the story of the coffin ship at 3 dinners, sat down hard upon a bench halfway through the tolling, and did not get up again for a long time. Sir Hugh Marden, who had followed the Duke into every line, went out into the lane bare-headed in the rain, and stood there until the water ran off him, and came back in wordless and grey, and no one remarked it, because the same arithmetic was being worked in every head in the room. Each of them had believed himself prudent. Each had taken a spread of safe, fashionable ships at thin premiums, a dozen small, careful bets, and each now understood, too late and all at once, that the dozen bets had been the same bet, and that the whole cautious table had gathered its money upon a single square and had it swept. The brass bell that had never in 30 years rung for a ship of the Duke's rang that fortnight for 11 of them. When the tolling stopped and the losses were reckoned, the head of the underwriters' table was broken. Not the Duke's fortune only, though that was gutted past the reach of his 3 counties, But the fortunes of Colfax and Marden and half the men who had followed his name, all of them staked upon the same drowned convoy, all of them down together. The syndicate that had ruled Verrex, that had priced the sea for a generation, had wagered itself upon a single week of weather, and lost. And the Perdita came home full. She came up the river on a clean north wind the very morning the last of the bell's echo died. The coffin ship, the cursed bark, the vessel every man in that room had refused to insure at any price. She had run her lonely eastern passage under Captain Frey, sound of copper and honest of timber, and the great gale that drowned the fashionable convoy had passed 1,000 miles to the west of her, and she had ridden out her own lesser weather and come home with her hold full of a rich Levant cargo that had trebled in value for the very losses that autumn had visited on everyone else. Cordelia had written her single name beneath the whole of that risk, at 18 guineas, the 100, when the room laughed. Now the room did not laugh. The Perdita paid her, cleanly and enormously. On the same grey morning the lost bell finished tolling out the Duke. Word of it ran up the lane faster than Cordelia could walk it. By the time she reached Verrex, the room already knew that the coffin ship, the churchyard hull, the vessel the whole table had refused at any price, had come up the river on a fair wind with her hold full, while the Fashion lay drowned upon its track, and that the single name written beneath the whole of that shunned risk, at a premium the room had laughed to hear, was vain. Men who a fortnight before had relished the prospect of her ruin now stood aside to let her pass, and the quality of their silence had entirely changed. It was no longer the hush men use to mark that a woman is being discussed. It was the older and more grudging silence men keep for a person who has been proved right at their expense and knows it, and has the grace not to say so. Cordelia's book stood when every other book at Verrex had fallen. She had spread where they had stacked. She had stood clear of the convoy that drowned them. She had backed the outcast ship the Fashion feared, and priced the storm the Fashion would not name. When the reckoning was done and the accounts were settled across the long table, the plain arithmetic of it was that the house of Vane, which had never been rich and never been ruined, was now the strongest name in the room, and the broken syndicate had need of capital and judgment, and there was only one person at Verrex who possessed both. It was Mr. Peck who put it into words, because Peck had earned the right, and because no one else had the courage. He rose at the long table in the raw days after the reckoning, in his snuff-brown coat, and he said plainly what the room had been circling for a week. The syndicate was broken. Its capital was drowned off the islands with the convoy, and its judgment had drowned along with it. For a syndicate is only the sum of the readings it can trust, and the table's readings had every one proved false in a single night. There was one book at Verrex that had come through the season whole, he said, and one name upon it that had priced the storm when the rest of them priced the Fashion, and Peck, for his own part, was too old to be governed by pride, and too near the end of his trade to spend his last seasons following ruined men out of mere habit. He would write beneath the Vane name gladly, he said, and count himself the wiser for it. Then he sat down, and the silence that followed was the sound of proud men making, each in his own time, the same surrender. They came to her at the foot of the table, the men who had seated her there as a jest. Peck first, who had known the truth of her for a season and needed no converting. Then the ruined others, hats in hand, with the particular awkwardness of proud men obliged to a person they had mocked. Would Miss Vane consider taking a leading line? Would Miss Vane consider ordering the book? Would Miss Vane, in plain truth, take the syndicate, for there was no syndicate left without her? And Cordelia Vane, a slight woman in an ivory and navy gown, dark hair drawn back, a level grey gaze, looked up from the book she had kept as a joke and had made the only ledger in the room worth a shilling, and she considered them, and she said that she would. The Duke came last. He came to her not at the crowded table, but the next morning, early, when the counting-house behind Verrick's stood empty, and the autumn sun came in low and gold through the tall window and lay across the long table in a broad amber bar, and the smoke and candlelight of the dark season were gone, and there was only clean daylight, and the smell of ink and sea. Cordelia was already there, at the head of the table now, the book open before her, ordering the wreckage into columns. Ravenscar stood in the doorway a moment, a tall man in a dark tailcoat, black hair swept back, a hard, clean-shaven jaw, and then he came in and stood across the table from her, where the sunlight caught him, and for once in his life he did not know how to begin. "You saw it," he said at last. "The convoy. You saw it in the book before it sailed." "I did." "How long before?" "Weeks." He was silent a moment. "You might have told me." "I might," said Cordelia. "And you would have heard a woman you seated as a jest presume to teach you your trade, and you would have defended your figures the harder for the shame of them, and taken the table deeper in to spite me. I have watched proud men meet the truth from an unwelcome mouth, your grace. They do not take it. They take offense." She looked up at him levelly. "You would not have believed me. You had to be shown by the only voice you have ever trusted, which is the sea." Ravenscar took that as a lesser man could not have taken it. He had been raised to be right, and had built a life upon never being made a fool, and here was the full account of his folly, laid out in a woman's clean, upright hand. And he stood in the sunlight and read it, and did not flinch from it, and that not flinching was the first genuinely admirable thing Cordelia had seen him do. When they seated you, he said slowly, "I thought it a cruelty, dressed as a jest. I told myself you would color and leave, and we would forget you by the second cup." He set one hand flat upon the table, upon the edge of her book. "You did not leave." "No. You kept the book we gave you to shame you, and it was the book that saw everything." He looked at the columns and then at her, and the hardness that had lived in his face all season was gone out of it, and what was under it was not contempt and not amusement, but something plainer and far more dangerous to a duke, respect, whole and grudgingly given. And then, as he looked at her, "Not grudging at all. I have sat at that table 20 years, Miss Vane, and I priced the fashion, and you priced the weather, and the weather came. I find I am ruined, and I find I do not much regret how it was done, which astonishes me above all the rest of it." He moved along the table as he spoke, slowly, until he stood not across from her, but beside the head of it, looking down at the ordered columns of the book, the losses set against the gains, the drowned convoy reckoned in one grim column, and the lonely Perdita in another, the whole story of the season told in her clean, upright hand. He had priced the sea for 20 years, and had never once seen it written so that the shape of a folly showed plain upon the page. "You kept this from the first morning," he said. "Every risk we took, every name, gathered in one book where a person with the wit to read it might see what none of us would. We gave you the pen to make you ridiculous." He almost smiled, and it was not a duke's smile, practiced and cool, but something rueful and human that had not been in his face all season. "It was the worst wager I ever laid, and I did not so much as know I had laid it." Cordelia regarded him in the amber light. She had won everything she had come for. Her father's name was paid and more than paid. The syndicate that had mocked her was hers. The proud head of the table stood across from her with his fortune gone and his contempt gone with it. She might have savored it. She found, a little to her own surprise, that she did not wish to. "The book will need a name it can trust to price the Western risks," she said, "now that I hold it. Someone who knows the fashionable trade from the inside, and knows now, better than any man alive, what it costs to mistake a stack for a spread." She turned a fresh page and dipped her pen and did not look away from him. "I do not need your name at the head of the table, your grace. I have my own there. But I could use your eye at my right hand, if you can bear to write beneath a woman's name the risks you once wrote above it." It was the offer of a partner, and they both knew it was more than that, and neither of them said the more of it aloud, because they were people who counted before they spoke. What lay between them was not a thing either had a figure for, and that to two people who trusted figures above all else was its own kind of astonishment. She had beaten him, wholly, fairly, in the one arena he had thought his own, and by every rule she had ever lived by that ought to have been the end of him in her regard, a defeated man to be pensioned off with a place at her right hand, and yet she found she did not want a defeated man. She wanted the one she had watched that season learn to read a thing he had refused to read, the one who had stood at the window unashamed of his own fear, the one who had taken the full account of his folly in the morning light and not looked away from a single line of it. That was not the Duke who had seated her as a jest. That was the man the ruin had made, and she had made the ruin, and there was a strange accounting in it that she did not try to resolve, because some sums are meant to be carried and not closed. The Duke looked at the pen she held out across the sunlit table, and at the level grey gaze behind it, and at the ledger that had beaten him more thoroughly and more fairly than any man ever had, and Julian, Duke of Ravenscar, who had never in the memory of that room been made to look a fool, and who had just been made to look one by the sea and by this woman together, reached across the amber bar of light and took the pen. "Show me," he said, "where you would have me sign." And Cordelia Vane, who had been let sit at the Underwriters' table as a joke, and had by that same morning outbid, outread, and outlasted every name upon it, turned the book toward him in the clean gold light, and showed him.